I think that those who have the greatest impact have all had those kinds of moments. Jesus himself spent 40 days in the wilderness, and Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness. For most of us, it's going to be somewhere in between those two numbers. I think that isolation does something that you can't get any other way. We can all say Jesus is my everything, but until everything else is taken away except Jesus, you don't really know if that statement is truth or not for you. And so there's a testing that takes place, not because God doesn't know the answer, but because you don't really know the answer. And you have to go through that test to get there. And when you do get through that and you do find that Jesus is enough, the other side of that wilderness experience, you're different. You're not the same person. That's why I say the person who wrote the second version of the book is different than the person who wrote the first one.
Welcome on to the show, Neil. We're going to be talking about your new book, Journeys. And you write that this book has been 30 years in the making. So tell us a little bit about your own history and especially the history of this book. What led you to write it?
So, early on, like in the mid 90s, actually early 90s, one summer I was reading 3 books at a time at once. One was The Making of a Leader by J. Robert Clinton, which is a seminal paradigm-shifting book on how God forms a leader. But I was also reading Roland Allen's paradigm-shifting book, Missionary Methods, St. Paul's or Ours. And simultaneous to that, I was reading the whole book of Acts every week for the whole summer. Those 3 things just connected for me, and I saw Paul's development as an apostle. And most of the time we look at Paul as a teacher, and he's a great teacher, but the reason he's such a good teacher is he's first a good learner. And I saw how he was growing and developing and learning as he went. Mm-hmm. And that was the framework. And that's still, to this day, the framework for the book. The problem is it's about the spiritual life formation of someone who finishes well. And in the early 90s, I was in my 30s, early 30s. I was not ready to write a book like this. So 15 years later, I wrote a version of it. And it was published. And the moment I held that book in my hand, God told me he was going to take me in a transition. And he did. Within just a short time, we had to shut down our offices. We had to shut down all of our online sales and books and all that stuff. I had to find new employment for my employees. I went unemployed for 13 years. I was in isolation. God told me to stop blogging, but I think he told most of the world to stop blogging, but he told me to stop doing social media and speaking at conferences. So I slowly stopped all of that. And for 13 years, I was in isolation.
What was the year range?
2011. Is when the book came out. The moment I held the book in my hand, that's a special moment for an author. You spend a whole year or so just working on writing and editing a book, and then the moment it comes in the mail and you hold it for the first time, it's like holding a baby for the first time. And then it was at that moment I heard God's voice say, I'm going to take you into a boundary or a period of transition. He didn't tell me how long it would be. He didn't tell me what it was about. And it just ended last year. So 13 years of isolation. He said I could speak as much as I wanted overseas, but just not in the States. I stopped social media. I could write books, but the sales of my books dropped off. After those 13 years, the first version of this book went out of print faster than any of my other previous books. In a short time, it was just didn't sell at all. And many people tell me it was my best book, but it didn't sell. So they gave me the rights back. I didn't have to buy them back. They just gave them to me. That's how valuable the book was to them. And I was just going to reissue the book. And God said, no, I want you to rewrite it. So I started trying to just tweak it a little bit, update it some. God said, no, rewrite the whole book. So I started at the beginning and rewrote the whole book to the end. It's very different than the original version, although it's also very familiar. It's the same structure and framework, but the person who wrote the second book is different than the person who wrote the first one. And I'll tell you this, when you write a book and you think in your heart, it's the best book I've written, and then God tells you to rewrite it, that means that the next book's got to be even better. And I think it does show that the person who wrote the second book has been through more. I'm still not ready to write the final version, but nobody really is that's still alive. So that's how the book came to be.
Jim is going to jump in here too, but maybe just by way of introducing, the book is called Journeys, and you mentioned Dr. Clinton's book, The Making of a Leader, as being very entwined with how you wrote this book and how you were thinking about the life of Paul through the book of Acts. So Clinton, a lot of our listeners aren't going to be familiar with him or that book. Tell us more about how he structured that book and the whole idea of a timelines, and it's where you got the idea for the idea of journeys, correct?
Yeah. Well, The Making of a Leader by J. Robert Clinton is built on decades of studying how God forms a leader over their lifetime so that they finish well. There's a lot of books on spiritual formation of leadership, but none have the depth of research that J. Robert Clinton had, that Bobby Clinton had. So his research, and he studied the lives of over 1,000 leaders, past and present, and how God formed their life. And he developed the phases of development that we go through and the process items that God uses to form our character and teach us what we need to learn. All of this so that we finish well. So his book is seminal. It's a paradigm shifting book. It's not an easy book to read. I always suggest people read it and keep a finger or a bookmark in the glossary, because you have to go back to the glossary regularly, because he coins his own phrases for everything.
Right.
He's pioneering in something nobody has really done the work on. And so he's coming up with his own language. And sometimes it's not familiar language. We have to keep up to date with it, but it is definitely a worthwhile book to read. And I'll tell you what, I held my breath. I sent the manuscript of the first book to him for an endorsement. And in a sense, if he didn't like the book, it would ruin the whole book. And I'd have to trash it. It would be decades of work down the drain. But fortunately, he loved it and gave me a very positive endorsement for it. So I'm very grateful.
Well, let me read the full title of your book. So the book is called Journeys. If folks go on Amazon.com, they can search Neil Cole Journeys. But the subtitle is Discovering God's Paths of Spiritual Formation, Building to a Strong Finish. And that's really where you begin to tie in this idea of God shaping and forming us over the course of our entire lives for the purpose that he has. You mentioned that people have done research, and I think it was only 1 in 3 leaders in the scriptures finished well. And then I don't know if this was research or just your observation, that number is probably even lower for us in modern life, that very few spiritual leaders in the church finish well. And your book is an effort to study the life of Paul to discern he is someone who finished well. So what can we learn about the journeys that God took him through that might be applicable to our own lives? Yeah.
That's actually from Bobby Clinton's book. That 1/3 of the leaders in the Bible finished well, and he says it so well. He says, "I think that's a little too optimistic in my study of leaders today for current leaders." Now, finishing well doesn't mean finishing popular.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean finishing famous. It doesn't mean finishing wealthy. Paul had none of those things when he finished.
Yes.
But he did finish strong in the eyes of God. And I think that's where our focus needs to be. So when he was at the end, only Luke was with him. Many of his spiritual children and grandchildren had abandoned him. He had nothing. He was not famous. He was more infamous than he was famous. But he still finished well. He kept the faith. He finished strong. He finished his race.
Yeah.
So that's the goal.
I love that insight. I remember that hit me maybe 2 or 3 years back. It dawned on me as you're reading 2 Timothy and some of those later letters of Paul. And I love the way you said it. You actually write, at the end, Paul was likely more infamous than famous, and known more for his jail time than his journey. So we look back at Paul from 2024 and we just see this hero of the faith, this amazing man of God. And from our point of view, of course, everyone would have deferred to him and looked up to him. And it's somewhat striking that he was a controversial figure in the early church in a lot of places. And maybe more infamous during his own and at the end of his life too. So I thought that was really insightful. Jim, I'm hogging the beginning here. I'm going to turn it over after this question. This will be like the last little preliminary setup questions before we really dive into the content of the book. I was just curious. You talked, Neil, about reading that summer, reading the book of Acts every week. So, if you think 3 months, you 12 times through the book of Acts in a very compressed period of time. You also wrote in the book here that you studied the book of Acts over 100 times in 30 years. What motivated you to that kind of intense exploration? And what are some of the ways it shaped your understanding of this book of the Bible and its lessons for us that are maybe distinct from what people might have been exposed to with the book of Acts?
Yeah, okay. So all of the disciple making, the ways that we make disciples in our movement has always been what we call life transformation groups. And what we do is we choose a book of the Bible, and 2 or 3 of us meet once a week together. We choose a book of the Bible we're all going to read on our own throughout the week, and we try to read between 20 and 30 chapters. So that would be all the book of Acts in a week. If you don't finish it, then you read it again the next week, and you keep reading Acts over and over again until all 3 of you finish, and then you move to another book. So that's been my practice in reading scriptures for 30 plus years, actually going on 40 years. So that's the way I devour all the scripture, not just the book of Acts. But to say that that's the only reason why I've given my life to Acts like that is not correct. I have a personal sense of identification with Paul. I don't think everyone needs that, but that is something that's in me. I'm a church planner, a missionary. I raise leaders. Paul is someone I identify with, so I wanted to learn from him. And he's been a hero of mine, and I look forward to the day I get to meet him. So that's why we read it that way. And it's still, even to this day, a passion of mine to learn more and more. This book is different from most other books in that a lot of people just look at Acts, and on the surface, they look at all the methods of Paul, and then they form one strategy that he employed. I think even my hero, Roland Allen, does that. But I think that's minimizing one of Paul's greatest strengths, and that's his ability to adapt and learn. So I discovered that in each journey, he improved upon what he did. He learned by his experience, and he took what he learned on the second journey into the third journey. He took what he learned on the third journey into the fourth journey. And every time his impact got deeper and broader at the same time. And so that's something that separates this book from most other books on Paul.
I love it. So this is a follow-on question to that. Sorry, Jim. Because I've often thought this, Galatians was so this idea of development and growth, even among a hero of the faith like Paul, whose life we're getting to see develop in real time as we read through the book of Acts and his letters. Is it your understanding that when you read a book like Galatians, which was many people think one of the first books that Paul would have written, first letters, and then you read a book like Ephesians, a letter that was written, much later in his life and after a lot of experiences in planting the church and sharing the gospel, they're both inspired by God. They're both completely trustworthy, but there is a filter of insights, I think, in terms of what does Paul talk about and how does he communicate in Ephesians versus Galatians? Is that something that you would agree with, or how would you put your own take on that?
Yeah, it's remarkable to me how God could inspire Scripture and use the human author, distinct from other human authors writing Scripture, but also distinct from his own person later in life.
Right.
And use him to write Scripture that is inerrant in its original autographs, but at the same time is reflective of who he is at that moment. So it's beautiful. It speaks to the immensity of God, and also it speaks to something of his graciousness in that he allows us to take part in his work and have our fingerprints all over it without destroying what he's doing, but actually enhancing it at the same time. God is just incredible, and that's all speaks to God, not to Paul or James or Peter, who are the authors. It's just God being God in that moment. And you can see a maturity factor in Paul's writing Galatians versus, a later book like 2 Timothy. A lot of change takes place, but doesn't take anything away from Galatians. Mm-hmm. God allowed him to write Galatians when he wrote Galatians, the man that he was when he wrote Galatians, because we needed that kind of a harsh, dogmatic, black and white letter, because the issue he's taking up there needs to be hit hard.
Yeah.
But when he's writing 2 Timothy, it's full of personal dealing with personal issues and darkness that he has to deal with in his own soul. And it comes out very passionate, and it's personal. It's it feels heavier. The soul of the book feels heavier, even though both books are inspired by God. It's amazing. Mm-hmm. We could write books on this and not hit bottom.
You mentioned that several times you mentioned that the Lord spoke to you, or that he communicated. I can't remember the exact words that you used, but for instance, after you wrote the book the first time, he basically communicated that you were going to go into this time of isolation. I've got a couple of questions on that. One is, how have you experienced God? I'm thinking of people who are hearing that, and God's never told me something like that, like something so specific and direct. How does God communicate to you? What did that look like?
Okay, sure. Hearing God's voice is not just a benefit of our spirituality. It's an essential ingredient. Jesus said, "My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me." This is, in fact, I think Paul even distinguishes those who hear God's voice from those who don't as being whether you're actually in his kingdom or not. It's very essential. Mm-hmm. So you might be hearing God's voice and just be considering it your own common sense or even your own conscience. So that's possible. But the truth is, for me, I'll have a train of thought. I'm going down a certain path in my mind. And when a thought comes that's unexpected, its source is not my mind, it comes from another direction. And that is always good, always right, always more profound and better, smarter than I am. Then I know it's God. I know it's God speaking. And that happens to me quite often in small, mundane ways, and also in greater, more significant ways, like that story I told. Mm-hmm. So I look for those things. If you hear something and you're not sure if it's you or if it's God. It could be just your imagination, you think. A lot of people, their minds are constantly ticking and they can't really discern whether it's them or God. God wants you to hear his voice more than you want to hear it. So if you ask him to show you this is from God, you say, God, I want to know what's you and what's not. Prove it to me in some way. Give me 2 or 3 witnesses to confirm it. Independent corroboration from other sources. He'll do that because he wants you to hear his voice. He wants you to understand. Now, if you're always at that level, you're not growing and maturing. There's an intimacy we have with God, and over the years, you should get more and more intimate. You should know his voice better and respond quicker. So that's a good place to start, but eventually you need to get to the place where the moment you hear God's voice, you know it's what God wants and you are willing to obey it. But it doesn't always start there.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate that. I just think of how some people listen to that, and you're right. I think we often doubt, like, is that God guiding me? Is that just my own thinking? So the idea that God wants to guide us and that we can ask him to give us confirmation when we're not 100% sure where that voice is coming from is definitely encouraging.
Right. Well, a large part of Christianity needs God to perform some miracle to verify that God is speaking. And I think he does that in less mature stages of our lives. But the further we get in intimacy with God, I think if your relationship, your intimate relationship with someone important requires that they shout and yell every time you want to hear them, then there's something wrong with the relationship. There needs to grow into an intimacy where you don't even have to exchange words. You just exchange glances and you know you're saying something important to each other. That kind of intimacy is possible, and it doesn't require that God shout with a miracle every time he wants to speak.
I think that's a great it's almost as if God is always going to communicate with us, regardless of where we're at in our spiritual journey, our spiritual maturity. But hopefully, as we progress and as we grow in our faith, we're able to discern that voice more clearly and without him having to shout or work miracles. So, well, Jim, I've been hogging up the conversation here. What are some questions that you had? I know you also read through the book over the past couple of weeks, and I think you had read the original that Neil had written, the first version. So I got the cleaned up, polished version. But what are some of the things that you would love to hear Neil address from what you learned in the book?
Yeah, Andrew, thanks for asking. And I really appreciate the discussion and the fresh take that Neil mentioned earlier about looking at Paul with a critical eye, in the best sense of the word, like critical, like he's growing, he's not God, he's developing. And so that helped me a lot. And one of the things that you wrote is that that it's not about Paul's personality or these things, but it was his committed following of Jesus that makes him one of the people that you want to emulate. You know, in the tradition that Andrew and I grew up in, it actually has a staunch position that Jesus is so much greater than Paul, and he must be stared at first, and it's almost to discard Paul. And I'm wondering if you would just talk about the tension, if it even is a tension, between our call to follow Jesus as our God and looking at Paul's life and how to do that well. If you'd speak to that.
Well, you know, the New Testament, the leaders in Jerusalem refer to Paul as the apostle to the Gentiles. And he was, but he also still is. All of the Protestant church looks to Paul as its leader. I think it's remarkable that if you go to the top evangelical theological society meeting with the theologians, and you ask them who is your greatest hero in the New Testament besides Jesus, they would all say Paul.
Sure.
But if then you go to the Evangelical Missionary Society and you're talking with the missionaries who go all over the world planting churches, who are not theologians, they're practitioners, and you ask them who their hero is in the New Testament besides Jesus, they would also say Paul. Mm-hmm. So Paul represents both these worlds, and he does so well. So he is, to us, a human example. He says oftentimes, follow me as I follow Christ, or the pattern you have seen in me, or in others, keep following. As long as he represents for us our need to find Christ, follow Christ, and be with Christ in everything. And so he becomes this flesh and blood example of what Jesus can be in a person. And even though he accomplished so many great things, not once was it his high intellect or his great gifts or skills. It was always just his willingness to follow Jesus no matter what the cost.
Yeah. Yeah.
His love for Jesus more than everything else shines brightly. For me, that is an example for us to follow. So, I think if we elevate, for instance, I mentioned somewhere that there are more books about Paul available on Amazon than about Jesus at one point. So that's how much Paul has become this apostle to the Gentiles still. However, I think Paul would be a little bit chagrined by that fact. Yeah. He would tell everyone to look at Jesus, that Jesus is the main thing, not me. And I think that is actually an example for us to follow, to make Christ our everything. And Paul couldn't be Paul if he didn't make Christ his everything.
It's a good question, Jim. I actually heard a podcast last week, and this was on X, Twitter, and it was on church planning. 34 minutes is the duration. And so a lot of names were discussed in this 34-minute video on church planning. Guess what one name was not mentioned one time? Jesus. Jesus was not talked about in 34 minutes of discussing church planning. So I think somewhere in there's a balance between, hey, we have, like Paul himself would say, hey, for us, there's only one Lord. And so there's only one intermediary. There's one great example that we're trying to follow. But to your point, Neil, several times Paul talks about, hey, join in following my example and observe those who walk according to the pattern you have in us. So maybe that's the balance, that as we see people who are hyper-focused on Jesus, there are lessons we can learn from them. And Paul was a great example, par excellence, of someone who was very much focused on Jesus and trying to pattern his life after him.
Yeah. Neil, one of the things, if I can ask another question that I really appreciated also about your book, is how much time you spent developing what happens in Paul before the first journey. And that obviously takes a little more scholarship, because I can kind of follow along in Acts pretty clearly what's going on in the first three journeys. But to piece together where Galatians fits and is kind of getting benched in Tarsus. But one of the things that you write is, I believe Paul worked out his new faith in the best place possible, not in Arabia, but in obedience, doing the work God called him to. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about the role of immediate obedience for new disciples as they come into faith, and what that does for them in the long-term trajectory, or may fail to do for them if they don't grasp a hold of that right away.
Sure. Yeah. You could summarize every book I've ever written and all the teachings I've ever given in one simple sentence: listen to Jesus and do what he says.
Yeah.
And if we all just did that, I think it would change the world in short order. Mm-hmm. It really boils down to that's the greatest thing we could do. And so Paul knew that, and he learned his lessons of faith and obedience. A lot of scholars early on, and I don't know where this came from or who originated it, but they all believed that Paul learned all of his theology and had special teaching time with Jesus in Arabia shortly after his conversion. But I don't think that jives with what we get in the scriptures. I think he was preaching the gospel, reasoning with the Jews right away. From the moment he could see again, he was preaching. And you don't get kicked out by secular police for sitting on a rock contemplating theology. They don't, I think all that happened in his being benched in Tarsus for 10 years. 10 or 11 years he spent in Tarsus. Those were hard years. I think it's interesting to contrast. You have 10 years in Tarsus where we don't hear any evidence of what happened. There's a verse that mentions there were churches from that area. Right. So maybe he started some churches. We don't know. We assume he tried.
Right.
Then he has 10 years where 5 different people groups are so well reached by the gospel that he says, I'm done here. I've got nothing else to do. I'm going on to Spain. Those two periods of time, you can fold them and they're the same amount of time. And the impact on the world doesn't just come from the second 10 years, but from the first 10 years. That you don't have those second 10 years if you don't first have those first 10 years. That time in the wilderness was difficult. There's a saying where he says, 5 times I received from the Jews 39 lashes, 3 times I was shipwrecked, 3 times I was beaten with rods. A night and a day I spent floating in the ocean, in dangers from robbers, in dangers from my countrymen, and dangers. Very little of that is shown in the book of Acts. All of that takes place probably during those 10 years. So those were harsh times for him. But those developed the man who could then see the next 10 years with such fruitfulness. So you have to really piece a lot of pieces together from the New Testament to figure out what was happening there. You have to not only know the epistles, but their time frame in the chronology of when they were written. So when he says 5 times I received from the Jews 39 lashes, that was written to 2 Corinthians. That's the 2 Corinthians book, which was written while he's on his 3rd journey. So when he says 3 times I was shipwrecked, that's before the shipwreck that takes place in Acts.
That's right.
Yeah. So that means he was shipwrecked 4 times that we know of.
Yeah.
So if Paul gets on your cruise ship, you need to get off at the next port. And I'm just glad he wasn't around during air travel. That would be really a big mess.
No, that's really excellent. And I appreciate the scholarship. And for all the listeners, if you're like, that's a little hard for me to piece that together, read the book, because Neil will do a nice job, and then you can be a Berean and go back and read the scriptures again and see if what Neil wrote was true, kind of paraphrasing Acts 17:11 there. So just searching for a little application here, do you think it is in God's nature, in I'll say almost all cases, to develop a leader that way by benching him in Tarsus at some point and shipwrecking him and beating him with rods? Like, should we, as disciples, should we kind of know this is probably coming if I want to walk with Jesus?
Yeah, I think so. I can't say dogmatically that it's true, but I think that those who have the greatest impact have all had those kinds of moments. Yeah. Jesus himself spent 40 days in the wilderness, and Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness. For most of us, it's going to be somewhere in between those two numbers. I think that isolation does something that you can't get any other way.
Yeah.
We can all say Jesus is my everything, but until everything else is taken away except Jesus, you don't really know if that statement is truth or not for you. And so there's a testing that takes place, not because God doesn't know the answer, but because you don't really know the answer.
Yeah, that's good.
And you have to go through that test to get there. And when you do get through that and you do find that Jesus is enough, the other side of that wilderness experience, you're different. You're not the same person. That's why I say the person who wrote the second version of the book is different than the person who wrote the first one. I went through 13 years of wilderness experience. I was benched for 13 years, And my audience these days is mostly young people, and when I say that, they're thinking that's half my life. That seems like a long time, and it was really hard during those times. I'll tell you that. I had no employment. It's humorous. I could tell you story after story of jobs I should have gotten that I didn't get, that were just insane. It was God who was behind this. There's nobody else that was doing this. And in the whole time, every bill got paid on time. Debts got resolved. Nothing in the house went neglected. Everything was taken care of. God took care of us. And as I was in it, it was hard. But on the other side, you look back at that moment, and it's fond memories. That was where God showed me who he really was. That was where God and I became tighter than ever. Yeah. Those moments, it makes it all worthwhile. I don't think Paul looks back at Tarsus as a hard time. I think he looks back at it as a time of intimate communication, revelation, insights that he would carry the rest of his life.
Yeah, that was one of the things I appreciated from the book was how you pieced together some of these formative seasons or experiences. One of them was, like Jim said, him being benched in the city of Tarsus, which, of course, when you read the New Testament, you kind of have to read that behind the scenes, or between the lines that was happening. You then also talk about how Barnabas went to get him and he brought him to Antioch. And of course, that's where we, again, sort of pick up the story with the Apostle Paul. One thing that jives with my own reading of the book of Acts is in chapter 13, when the Holy Spirit tells the church there to set apart Barnabas and Saul for the work to which he had called them. You talk about this a little bit in the book about how there were 5 leaders mentioned in the church there at Antioch. And I don't know if you brought out this particular point, but it seems to me that the order of names is significant in Scripture. So when you get the list of the 12 apostles, Peter's always first, Judas is always last, and that's not accidental. Well, when you get the list of leaders in Antioch, Barnabas is first, Paul is last. So I've always wondered, hey, could it be that Paul was really the junior member of that team? Again, thinking back to say, we think of Paul as this undisputed leader, the author of much of our New Testament scriptures. But Paul was really being formed and being shaped. Paul was a rookie, so to speak, at this point, when it came to the way God was going to use him. Would you agree with that, or what are we seeing with Paul there at Antioch?
Well, it would be hard to say definitively what you're saying is true. I think Paul was probably the last to join the team. Mm-hmm. I don't know that makes him a junior member or not. Mm-hmm. I think that the language, so Luke's Greek is the best Greek in the New Testament as far as the mastering the language. And it may be because he's Gentile. We don't know for sure if he's Gentile or not, but he's definitely, this is his primary language. Yeah. And he is, when you read Luke or Acts and you compare it, say, to John's epistles or John's letters or John's writing, it's night and day. The Greek is very different. And Luke is very precise in his language. So I think that what he says is that at Antioch, there were leaders, there were prophets and teachers. And he lists them in order, Barnabas and then all these others, and then he ends with Paul. It could very well be that what he's saying is that of the prophets, Barnabas was a prophet, and of the teachers, Paul was definitely a teacher. And the reason he separates them like that is to show us that there's no doubt Paul was serving as a teacher, because he's mentioned last and teachers are mentioned last. And Barnabas was a prophet because Barnabas was mentioned first and prophets was mentioned first. That's the only thing I think you can take away from that has some kind of a weight to it. That's not just conjecture. But even that has some conjecture. But I think that looking at Luke's precision with his language, I think the order of the names and the order of the prophets and teachers is significant.
Yeah. What about, sorry, Jim, did you want to jump in there?
Well, I just was in that vein, if you would comment maybe on, I think it's in Acts 14, where the precise Luke in Greek switches to Paul and Barnabas instead of Barnabas and Paul. And I'm really interested in the dynamics between the mentor and mentee and what's going on with Paul and Barnabas, and even the split that's going to come later. But maybe if we could just start with the switch in the language, that something's happening there.
Barnabas is a hero, and we need to really understand what an incredible man of God he is. Right now, I would say we don't get enough scripture on Barnabas.
Yeah.
But imagine how little we would have if Jerusalem leadership sent him to Antioch to check out this church and see what was going on and report back. And if that's all he did, he'd be a footnote in the Bible.
Yeah.
But that's not what he did. He went to Antioch, saw what was going on, and then decided to go on a minimum 300-mile journey on foot to go search for Saul in Tarsus. And the way the language is written by Luke, it wasn't an easy thing. He had to go looking for him. He had to investigate to find him. So he finds him and brings him back. And that's a minimum of 300 miles on foot. And nobody asked him to do that but God. There was no expectation. In fact, it may have been that people were saying, why are you doing that? That's not what you were asked to do. But he did that. If he had not brought Saul back to Antioch, we probably wouldn't even have Barnabas mentioned in the New Testament. But his humility of being able to say, okay, set apart for me Saul and Barnabas and Saul for the work I called them to. And then later it becomes Paul or Barnabas and Paul. And then it's Paul and Barnabas. And at one point he actually says Paul and his companions. And Barnabas just becomes
Barnabas got downgraded to a companion.
It shows you his humility. And I think he was driven as a person to identify what is in you that's special that God wants to bring out. And he did that for Paul. He did that for Mark. I think he consistently was more interested in finding out and elevating you than himself. And that is what Philippians 2 defines as true humility in the image of Christ. And that is who Barnabas was.
That's good.
There are so many of these little insights. I know that this isn't even I want people to understand that this isn't even the main theme of the book. I mean, the main theme of the book, I mean, Neil, you really weave in all of these insights. And I think it's because you've studied it over 100 times in 30 years. But there were some things that you wrote that I just thought, yeah, that's right. But I've never heard anyone say it. I've never thought it myself. And I've read Acts a few times. I really appreciated your insights on Stephen. And I don't think I've ever seen anyone talk about the impact that Stephen, the martyr from Acts 6 and 7, had throughout the life of Paul. What were some of the things, just for our folks who are listening or watching, what were some of the ways that experience, Stephen's life and death, and how Paul was part of that, impacted Paul, that we can see throughout the New Testament?
Yeah. Well, you can see Paul bring up constantly, both in Acts and in the epistles, how he sees himself as the chiefest of sinners because I persecuted the church. And all of that goes back to the stoning of Stephen, where Paul was the the one where they laid their jackets, their coats at his feet. He was the one in the moment that was delegated to oversee this execution of a man of God, which at the moment he thought was righteous. And even then it was in contrast to his own mentor, Gamaliel, who thought you shouldn't do that. He did it and became a persecutor of the church. And that scar would last throughout his life. It would give him a sense of purpose, so that when he returned from Arabia to Jerusalem, the first thing he does is he goes to the Hellenistic synagogue to preach the gospel to the people, the very people that Stephen himself would have been preaching to. Mm. So he tries to pick up the mantle of the man that he felt so bad about overseeing his death. And God says, well, that's not your plan. You need to get out of here. I have something else planned for you. And then you see in his first journey, there was one sermon that's pretty well spelled out by Luke. It's captured in the book of Acts. And it very much mimics the way Stephen's style of preaching. And I know, I've mentored many Christian leaders throughout my life. And oftentimes you go in these early stages, you start to mimic those people you look up to. Yeah. Your sermons sound like them. Your books sound like them. Your ministry looks like theirs. And I think that's okay. Having been an art student, some of your early assignments, you need to just go copy the masters. You need to learn from them. But if you only do that, you just become valuable to the art thieves. You need to expand to become your own artist. You need to be able to have your own innovation and creativity and beauty that you bring to the world, not just mimic someone else's. And so that's what you see happening with Paul. He starts mimicking Stephen. He starts trying to fulfill Stephen's job. And God says, no, I had Stephen and I have you, and you're very different. And I have something, other plans for you, Paul. Mm. And so his whole life, he was having to overcome memories of his regrets. And I think that's part of all of us. We all have things we regret in life. And the question is, are those scars things that hold you back, or are those scars that motivate you to become better and more like Christ? Are the wounds of your past, are they holding you back, or are they propelling you forward? Those are the questions. And so for Paul, they propelled him into a greater calling, a greater giftedness, and he became better because of them. And that's what I would hope for all of us.
Yeah, that is so well said. And I hope folks will check it out, because just that thread that you weave throughout the book of how Stephen keeps popping up throughout Paul's life as either directly or indirectly a shaping personality and force that marked his life for the duration. Jim, what else? I know we've got Neil for a little bit longer here. What else stood out for you that you'd love to hear him unpack?
Yeah, there's so much more, and I just hope the listeners can appreciate. This is not a spoiler alert podcast on the book. It's more like a trailer. Okay, so please, you're missing out if you don't get into it. But maybe a little bit more on this dynamic of now Paul and Barnabas when they split. Because if you're going to really elevate Paul, this is going to be one of the hardest places for you to elevate him to. His humanity probably most comes out in this decision, because the way you kind of developed it is like, look at what Barnabas did to elevate Paul. And now Barnabas is doing the same for John Mark, and Paul will not extend the same grace to John Mark that was extended to him. And you call this adolescent rebellion syndrome. And that really got my attention. Because it's really interesting to see the dynamics of Paul to his mentors, Gamaliel, Barnabas, and then kind of going the other way as Paul tries to raise people up. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how to handle that on both sides. If I'm feeling rebellious to a mentor and I'm trying to mentor someone that's being kind of cantankerous, and what you glean from Acts there and Paul's life.
Yeah. So I would just first want to say that I learned that language, adolescent rebellion syndrome, ARS, from Ralph Moore, who is more experienced than all of us on the planet at sending off young church planners to start new churches. Okay. And so early on, I was having these people who I loved and they loved me, and we had this tight relationship. And then I send them off, and the moment they're sent, I become this idiot in their eyes. They don't want to hear anything from me. And I couldn't understand it until I met with Ralph, and he explained it to me. When someone is given the task that suddenly, okay, now it's your turn, it's your job. Well, you take that very seriously, and you think, I'm going to do things right. And so you don't want to, you've already learned from your mentor. Now it's my turn to do my own thing. Yeah. And adolescent rebellion will, if the mentor responds as a parent, as an adult to the situation, and doesn't respond immaturely and loves them through it, they'll return in about a year, and usually with tears, and say, I don't know what I was thinking. And I've experienced that multiple times. If the mentor responds immaturely and says, well, you reject me, I reject you, that relationship may never come to reconciliation. So just expecting someone to say, even Paul, after the first journey and all the fruit they had, said, there's something, we can do this better. And now it's my turn. I am going to do it better. And I'm going to recruit a large team so that we can leave leaders behind. Yeah. So that their churches are not weak like the Galatian churches and easily led astray by anyone who comes along and says, I'm a leader. So he does that. And so like all of us, he recruits leaders to fill gaps. And when you're going to recruit leaders, you want to have the highest standard that you can. And John Mark did not meet that standard in Paul's eyes. So I think Barnabas was a little bit humored by that, and probably, it doesn't say this, but probably brought up the fact that, I gave you a second chance, Paul. So I think John Mark would not compromise on that. There's a lot of I'm sorry, I rephrase that. Barnabas wouldn't compromise on that. There's a lot of things Barnabas had grace and patience with, but judging young leaders and excluding them was not one. And so he drew a line there. Paul drew a line there. And God used that to create two teams to cover twice as much ground, start twice as many churches. And I think the whole overall lesson of the second journey was to multiply. And God forced that even at the very start.
Yeah, thanks for that. And yeah, you gave some great insights on how he approached things in the second journey, which I won't delve into now, but that also blew my mind. So, Andrew, I'll pass it back to you because this has been fantastic for me. I pray that it blesses everybody else as much as it's blessed me.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much more that we could dive into in this conversation, but we do try to keep it to about an hour. So, Neil, maybe we can have you back on in the future. It'd be great.
I'd love that. I'm enjoying this.
Yeah, at the risk of burying the lead, the book is called Journeys, and it's really about the journeys that Paul took. We hear that often, the first missionary journey, the second missionary journey, the third missionary journey. You talk about the fourth missionary journey, which I think was really interesting, which is really Paul's time in prison and how God worked through him to spread the gospel and to see churches planted throughout the Roman world. But as you investigate each journey or each stage of Paul's life, there are just tremendous insights about how God shapes us and how God works through people and circumstances to develop us kind of on the inside, and also lessons that Paul was learning about how to better share the gospel and communicate it and start churches and make disciples. And so you see that progression throughout these four journeys of Paul. So thank you so much, Neil, for writing the book. It's tremendously insightful. And anyone who's serious about discipleship, following Jesus and allowing him to shape you, and disciple making, helping other people come to know and follow Jesus, this book is going to be right up your alley, because that's really at the heart of what Neil is describing, how God did both of those things in the life of Paul. So any last words that you would want to share about the book?
Yeah, it's my background is in art. And so as I approach the books that I write, I want them to be innovative and creative. And this book, I took a risk. Most books, you just want to have one idea, get that idea across in a simple way as possible, and then you have a broader audience. But with this book, I wanted to look at Paul's whole life and be mostly biographical of Paul, but also look at how God forms spiritual leadership and spiritual formation, marry those things together, and at the same time bring out missional strategies and lessons learned about strategy and add that to the book. So there's like these three things woven together. If you think that sounds too complicated, or you listen to this podcast and you think, oh, it's a scholarly book because of all these insights, the truth is it's woven together as one narrative story. It's easy to read. It's not hard to read. It's like reading a fictional novel of how someone's life changes with applications at the end of each chapter. Mm-hmm. And so I don't want you to get the idea that it's too much or it's too complicated. It's not. It's very easy to read. And so that was the risk I took in writing the book. And I think that for me, you could write a book that sells a lot of books, or you can write a book that's a good book. Sometimes there's both those things cross over. But for me, it's always that if I'm given that choice, I'm going to put my heart into writing the best quality book I can. And at this point, I think Journeys is that. And it's an outgrowth of 30 years of my life. And I also, in the latter book, I took out a lot of the personal examples because I wanted it to be about Paul rather than me. In the earlier book, each chapter, I put in my own examples of those lessons learned. I took all those out pretty much because I didn't want to make it about me. I wanted to make it all about Jesus. I would be interested, Jim, in you've read both versions. What were your thoughts on the difference between them?
Well, that was actually my biggest observation, was that a lot of the personal examples came out, which I loved those because they weren't self-aggrandizing examples. They were very humble examples, which helped all of us go, okay, this is it's a book about being a learner as a disciple. Other than that, I actually went through both kind of side by side, and I could find most of the same content. So I could find a lot of it. And so I had to search sometimes, and there was a couple of places like, well, I can't bring that up because that didn't make the cut in a couple of places. And I did notice things were reworded a little bit, maybe just to be more clear or precise. So I don't know if you're out there and you can get the original copy, you want to read some of Neil's autobiographical lessons learned, then you get your hand to that, get a hold on that too.
Yeah, there's a couple of things. I want it to be a book that has legs that lasts a long time. Yeah. So if I thought a story was bound to here and now, but might not be as relevant 20 years from now, I would take it out. Yeah. Secondly, I wanted to have a broader audience. During this 13 years, God shifted me from writing to church leaders to writing to young people not associated with church. So the language had to change from leadership language to spiritual formation language. So that's also a change. But other than that, the framework's still there. The story doesn't change. I did take out some of my personal stuff just to make it more about Paul. And
one more thing I should drop is in the second version, there's some nice discussion questions. And I actually went through this with one of our churches, and we grabbed some random discussion questions off the internet. Not good questions. These questions are much better. So go ahead and use this with a group and use those questions at the end.
Yeah, the book is very well organized. It's very readable, like you said, Neil. So I appreciate you taking the time, not just the time to write it, but the time to live the lessons so that you could write it and follow Jesus. We've got it linked here. If you're watching on YouTube, it's in the video description below, or if you're listening to this, it's in the show notes. Yeah, like I said before, would highly encourage you to pick it up. It's great insights, and I think it'll give you, like Jim was saying, things to think about in your own life. How is the Lord perhaps working to shape you, and how can you partner with him so that you finish well? So, Neil, thanks for coming on today and sharing with us.
Oh, this is my pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity.